So thank you, Marcus. Thank you also, Eric and Andrea, for everything as well, and thank you to everybody who's mentioned here, and to everyone for coming. I'm going to now introduce our three panelists. Just a little disclaimer beforehand. I actually don't know them extremely well. So what I'm going to say is most of what I'm going to say about them you can find in the program booklet or online somewhere. So Tudin Jimba Langrila, who has a Geshe Larampa from Gandhin Shadze, holds a BA honors in philosophy and a PhD in religious studies from Cambridge University. He is adjunct professor at McGill University, which is in my own hometown of Montreal. He's associated with Princeton University's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research.
Stanford.
Thank you. And Minded Life Institute as well. He is founder and president of the Institute of Tibetan Classics and general editor for the Library of Tibetan Classics. He is highly respected and revered as a scholar, is extremely well published, both in English and in Tibetan, and has been, for many non-Tibetan speakers, the voice that has allowed many to comprehend and access the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike since 1985. So welcome.
Thank you.
I'm doing this in order of speaking, in order in which the panelists are going to speak. So Roger Jackson is the second, will be speaking next. PhD in 1983 from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Sitting under the, unfortunately, recently deceased Geshe Lhundrup Zopa. Currently professor of Asian Studies and Religion at Carleton College in Minnesota. Was longtime editor for JIAB, so Journal of International Association for Buddhist Studies, and currently editor for the Indian International Journal of Buddhist Studies. And his research has dealt with philosophy, ritual, meditative practices, and poetry, to name but a few. And he is currently completing an anthology of Gelugpa Mahamudra texts, from what I understand. So welcome, Roger. Sarah Harding, who I only met yesterday for the first time, began practicing Buddhism in 1974 and completed the first ever 3-year retreat in the West in 1980. She's been teaching, as most of you know already, teaching at Naropa University since 1992. Her work includes translations of Tibetan practice, commentaries, and works by figures such as Jamgon Kongtrul Patu Rinpoche, Pema Lingpa, and she is the author of Niguma Lady of Illusion and Machik's Complete Explanation, clarifying the meaning of Chut. Though she says she is a counterfeit scholar, she is also a bona fide practitioner and a highly skilled translator and teacher who combines both Buddhist practice and scholarly rigor in her work. And she also has a great sense of humor, which you just saw by the fact that she actually laughed at that.
Hey, your joke.
And I'll probably get in trouble for saying stuff like this later on. Anyway, welcome, Sarah. So I'm going to turn over the discussion to Tudin Jimba.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. It's really a great pleasure for me personally to be part of this large gathering of people, all of us who share deep affection and also a profound connection with the Tibetan tradition in our lives, both professional and personal. So to be part of this group as a Tibetan is both humbling as well as also I feel a sense of gratitude to all of you who have chosen and decided that this tradition is really worth paying your attention and time and dedication. So thank you. What I thought I would do in my short presentation is to really kind of, say a few words about what the Tibetans themselves have thought about what translation is all about. As you all know, Tibetan tradition, which is really the source tradition in this particular conversation, is essentially a product of translation. And that's one of the unique characteristics of the Tibetan tradition. And it makes it very explicit, because to the point when authority is invoked, lineage, the Indian lineage, matters a lot. So it is a self-consciously translation culture. It's a product of translation. So I felt that if we can have a little glimpse into what the Tibetans themselves thought about what translation is all about, maybe this will set a larger background in which this conversation we're going to have might have a different kind of flavor. So let me begin by with a quote. One of my favorite quote when it comes to translation. This is from Ralph Waldo Emerson. What is best in any book is translatable, any real insight or human sentiment. And all of us who have been involved in translation in one way or another, we operate from the premise that we actually believe in this. Otherwise, why bother? We do believe. Now, it may be a varying degrees of what is it that is being brought across, but we do believe that when our act of translation does matter, and we are the medium through which the great masters of the past will speak to the modern reader. And that's a basic premise that we operate from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to 3 sources from the Tibetan tradition, very briefly, since I have only 10 minutes. One is Dajro Pambu Nipa, the bilingual lexicon that was created right at the beginning of 9th century when the language was reformed and standardized. The second is a reference to Ngoklon Zewa Londam Sharap, around the end of 11th century, beginning of 12th century, whose influence in the way in which the Tibetan tradition comes to engage with the classical Indian works, particularly those of philosophical nature, really had a lasting influence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about him. And third, finally, I will say a few words about what Sakya Pandita, one of my most favorite authors among the Tibetan writers, thought about translation, because Sakya Pandita was a great linguist and a grammarian and Sanskritist in his own right, and what he thought about translation is quite interesting. So those are the 3 things that I will. So the first one is, this is, the Dajro Pampani was very interesting. It was compiled together at a meeting of, most of the important Tibetan translators of that time, along with the great Indian masters who were present. And then they sat down and wrote this down. And in one of the opening statements, there is this statement that says, with respect to the approach to translating the Sublime Dharma, undertake this in a way that does not violate the meaning, the emphasis is mine, and at the same time is appealing to the sensibilities of the Tibetan language. So this morning we were really exposed to a wonderful presentation from David Bellows, and you can see echoes of that tension in David's presentation. Now, more specifically, Dajro Pambu goes on to then actually gives you instructions how to do this. And one of the it says is that when it comes to word orders and syntax, Tibetan should be the priority. Unless the particular word syntax of a text, like a mantra, has a special meaning, the word order and syntax should be really the Tibetan, not Sanskrit. Second, if the text is verse, keep the verse structure. I think that, and this is something that I've insisted in my own Library of Tibetan Classics series. I have, appealed to all the translators. If the source is in verse, please retain it in verse. Then another thing that Dajro Pambu Nipa says is that the original terms that has multiple meanings should not be really reduced into one translation. In those situations, keep the original terms. Like example given is Gautama and Kaushika. So in the sutras, they were left untranslated. And then names of places, animals, and flora, where by creating neologisms, like new words, it will create more confusion because the readers will have simply no framework to understand that neologism. In that case, it's better to keep the original. And in some cases, you might need to add flower something, like metal, some metal zambaka or something. Add something, but keep the original. And then it has a lot of things to say about how to handle the Sanskrit grammatical particles, which may not completely match the Tibetan language structure. So those are some of the specific items I listed from Dajo Pampanyipa. So I'm going to now run forth. Next is Ngolondin Sherab. Ngolondin Sherab is probably, one could say, arguably, the founder of Tibetan scholasticism, scholastic tradition. He did a lot of translations, but where he really excelled and dedicated is the translations of Pramana texts, epistemology and logic, and so-called Maitreya collection of texts. Those were the two areas where Ngolondin Sherab was really well known, most known for. And he did not, I mean, to my knowledge, make any specific comments about the actual theory and practice of translation. And in his own translation, he was much more straightforward. He never really, fiddled with, changing the structure of the text. But what he was known for is creating indigenous study aids that can help the Tibetan reader to read. So summary points is he wrote, and later this is what evolved into the Sache system. So, and all of you are familiar with this. I'm not going to go into this. Third is Satya Pandita. Satya Pandita was very interested in, trying to understand why some Tibetan translations don't read well, and it's difficult to understand, and why some do. And he was more interested in trying to find out why some of the translators failed is because they were not exposed well enough to the cultural context of the Sanskrit texts. This is what Professor Bellows was talking about, that you need to have a lot more to understand the text. So he talked about idiosyncratic approach to translation, using vernaculars, misunderstanding the meaning of synonyms, chopping the Sanskrit word in the wrong way, all of this. And then, for example, he gives an example of how Yangjema should have been Sojung Lhamo and not, Yangjema. So these are, and then he talked about how sometimes if you don't understand this well, then there is a danger of backward reading into the Tibetan, an etymology which does not exist in the original, like Yishi. Ye does not exist in the Sanskrit. So if you try to have a gloss, it doesn't work. So to conclude, what I see emerging in these Tibetan scholars' engagement is kind of a tension felt between two poles, that every translator faces. One is the pole of being faithful to the source. So that emphasizes, demands rigor and literal approach and all the rest. At the same time, there is the other pole, which is the making the text accessible to the reader. Like George Bellows was talking about, being kind to the reader. That requires fluidity and more creative appropriation, and it's a tension. And I don't think the tension is avoidable. Then there's what I would call three conflicting allegiances. You have an allegiance to the reader, but you have allegiance to the cultural context of the text in order to make it really speak. And then you have the allegiance to yourself. You can never step out of your own shadow. In the end, as Professor Bellows pointed out, that you have to take responsibility for creating the meaning of the text you produce. No translator can avoid that. So to conclude, what I would like to have pointed out is that if you look at even this very brief example of how the Tibetans have thought about translation, it is quite clear that at least those Tibetans who have given some critical reflection, understood translation to be a complex enterprise, complex, creative, interpretive. I don't think any of these masters assume translation to be a kind of a naive, simple approach where, your job is to produce a carbon copy of what was there in the original, like such so-called pure translation. Of course, that leaves the larger question. In that case, how do we understand what is that it, that we bring from one language to another, and how does translation play a role in bringing that across to another language? And that is the larger topic of our conversation. And I'm really looking forward to, learning more about this as our conversation grows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bala.
Okay, am I audible? Yes. to myself anyway. I was in correspondence with a friend of mine a few weeks ago asking him if he was going to be coming to the conference, and his reply was, I thought about it, but I actually prefer translating to talking about translation. I take his point on a certain level, but I'm actually delighted to be here and glad that this meeting is happening. I'm going to make a few very general comments about translation and then home in on some particular issues that seem to me we face as translators of Tibetan, and exemplify that by talking about 3 different translation projects I've been involved in over the course of 40 years now almost. It's easy in some ways if you're a translator and you think about the difficulty of it, what T.S. Eliot calls the intolerable wrestling with words and meanings, to despair of the whole project, to feel that, as we know from the title of a panel this afternoon, you know, traditore, right? This is the kind of cliche about translation, that we're always betraying the original. And yet, I've got to say that in my many years now as a scholar, doing all sorts of scholarly work, from kind of popular pieces to philosophical things to anything in between, I think I seldom feel the pleasure, the sheer pleasure that I do in anything else as when I translate. And again, this is recognizing the incredible difficulty of it, the fact that you're not quite getting it, will never quite get it. It's an impossible process. I often think of a line from a Samuel Beckett play. I think it's Ole Beaujour. I can't go on, I must go on. I can't go on, I must go on. And I sometimes feel like my career as a translator has been a bit like that. You do get these serendipitous moments where, you know, suddenly it all seems to flow together. You find the right word. There's a Gay and Wilson cartoon, which if I'd thought ahead, I would have had up here, but that would have been my only visual, but I don't have it with me, that I have on my office door, which is from quite some years ago, an old scholar, kind of books everywhere, sitting at his desk, bespectacled, looking up, and he says, you know, for a minute there, it all almost made sense. That's the situation I feel we're in many respects. But I want to actually echo something that was said this morning. Jinpa raised it in his question, and I was going to make this observation as well, that translation may be an impossibility on a certain level, yet it is a necessity, because the way I would put this is we are translated beings. It's not just that translation is something that occurs between, you know, source culture and target culture, but it's something that happens all the time within cultures, within and between different realms of discourses, and even within our own minds, neurons trying to communicate with the rest of the body. Translation is something we always do, and so why not do it? The particular points that I want to get to, in a slightly more specific, it seems to me, and this also comes off of Jinpa's point about the Tibetan recognition of the complexity of all of this, that when we're undertaking translation, there's a number of different considerations we have to keep in mind. This came up in the talk this morning as well. In our particular case, who is our audience? Is it the general public? Is it Buddhist practitioners? Is it academics? I think we wrestle with these questions often, regardless of the particular context from which we're doing a translation. What is our process? Is it solitary? I mean, there's been a lot of jokes about solitary translators, and yet many of these solitary translators are, as we know, involved in committees, in larger projects. So solitariness is a bit of an illusion. Is it consultative? That is, it's a project of ours for which we are consulting with others? Or is it collaborative in whatever that term may mean? The question, I would put it this way, because I probably enjoy translating poetry more than anything else: how much poetic license are we allowed in translation? How literal or figurative must our translation be? Certainly in translating from Tibetan to English, and I think this is echoed in some of the things that Jinpa has mentioned, we want to avoid, there's a sort of Scylla and a Charybdis here, or we might say two extremes to be more Buddhistic about it. On the one hand, we want to avoid what Paul Griffiths famously called Buddhist hybrid English, or what one of my teachers called Tiblish, which is in a way a form of translation that doesn't go far enough in meeting the target culture and language where it is. The other extreme then is what the Chinese, and my pronunciation will be wrong, so forgive me, but the Chinese would call geyi, the matching concepts idea, where you simply plug in something from your culture and that substitutes for and gives you then the illusion that you understand a term that is quite foreign. In terms of, even more specifically, as translators of Tibetan, I think there's a number of questions we have to face and try to decide. This point about decision is an important one. Three of them jump out at me. Given how foundational Indian Buddhism is for Tibetan Buddhism, what's our relation and responsibility to original Indic sources? This may be somewhat less of a problem if we're dealing with strictly Tibetan texts, but so many Tibetan texts are directly or indirectly related to Indic originals that this is something we need to deal with. And it touches then, of course, on the whole question of competence in Sanskrit or other Indic languages. A second is, what is our relation and responsibility to Tibetans who may be our consultants or collaborators on projects? I think none of us here who's done translation has not been involved with Tibetans at one level or another of our work, and yet there can be tensions, as we all understand. Thirdly, what is our relation and responsibility to contemporary academic practices and standards, as defined in, let's call it, the world of Buddhist studies, for want of a better term. So I'm going to kind of wrap up by just very briefly mentioning the ways in which some of these problems have been played out in, as I said, 3 different projects I've done or been involved with over the years. The first is the work that essentially came out of my dissertation and really my first book, Is Enlightenment Possible? It's got a long subtitle, but it's basically a translation and fairly extensive discussion of Gyaltsabje's Gelugpa commentary on the second chapter of Dharmakirti's Pramanavartika, which is sort of, for me, and I think for many people, the locus classicus for a Buddhist philosophy of religion. My audience for this, since it was kind of out of my dissertation, was largely an academic one. I did try to write an introduction that was fairly accessible. I don't know if I succeeded or not, but it was an academic audience I was targeting mostly. The process in this case was consultative in that I worked with Geshe Zopa as well as with Geshe Namgyal Wangchen when I was over in Sarnath, particularly on Gyaltsab's commentary, though there was much there in my footnotes and my introduction that weren't involved there. My degree of poetic license was quite low. I was trying, I thought of it as fidelity, but probably people who read the translation will think of it as being in Tiblish. And the issues that this is, I think, the more interesting part, the issues that I faced, there were 2 in particular that came up. One of them was in relation to my Tibetan consultants, in particular to Geshe Zopa, who was my advisor. He was perfectly happy with the translation. He was not, to be honest, perfectly happy with all the philosophical observations I made in either my introduction or the footnotes, because I was, to be honest, slightly more skeptical about the probative value of Dharmakirti's arguments for past and future lives and so forth than he was. So, this was a point. The other point, and this came up after the book was published, had to do with the degree. I was criticized in a review by Eli Franco for not being sufficiently Indological in my approach to Dharmakirti. I tried to make it very clear in my introduction. I'm reading this through Gyaltsop's commentary. That I'm not pretending to unearth the Sanskrit original of Dharmakirti, but it was a criticism that was made, and it certainly gave me pause, and I think it's the kind of criticism that should give us pause in any case. Second project I'll talk quickly about is Tantric Treasures, a very different kettle of fish in your ear, which is, as a couple of you may know, a translation of fundamentally from the Apabhrangsha, but with Tibetan where necessary, of the Doha Koshas of Tilopa, Kanha, and Saraha. And here the audience was very different. I had in mind a book that might be accessible and useful in the undergraduate classroom in the U.S. The process was as close to solitary as I think I've ever had in a scholarly project. Of course, I've depended in many ways on conversations and texts and so forth, but it was really me doing most of this work. My degree of poetic license was considerable in this. And the issues that I faced were, again, the question of relation to Indic originals, wrestling with Apabhrangsha, something that is not commonly taught even in graduate programs, was difficult. Trying to deal with all the issues connected with that. And for me, of course, the key question was the whole matter of how much liberty I could or should take in my poetic, quasi-poetic translations of these Indic originals. And I chose deliberately to take quite a bit of liberty, at least in the way I organized it. I felt that I still was being reasonably faithful to what was there in the original text. Finally, a project on which I worked with Jinpa and many other people as well, the Crystal Mirror of Philosophical Systems, a translation of the great early 19th century Tuken Drumta. Here, the audience was something like a mix of practitioners and scholars, perhaps. We certainly wanted to make it very scholarly, but we wanted to make it accessible to a larger audience than just the academic community. The process was thoroughly collaborative. There were 5 or 6 of us who were intimately involved in it. Geshe Zopa was really the overseer of the project. I was the editor for the volume. I think our degree of poetic license was medium, and the fact that it actually reads as fairly well as some people have told me they think it reads is largely due to good editing by David Kittelstrom. He's a wonder. The issues here were unification of styles, and I think any collaborative project faces this as a real difficulty when different people are doing different sections, how you bring all those together. And an interesting question, and I'll kind of pretty much end with this because I know I've gone over by a few minutes here, is an interesting question that came up for people who were consulted about the volume at various stages was the whole question of Tuken's authorial bias. When Geshe Zopa met with the previous Dujom Rinpoche many years ago in Nepal, Rinpoche was not pleased with the way that Tuken presented the Nyingma tradition. And when we ran this by Matthew Kapstein for his vetting early on, I think he felt a little bit the same way as well. And much later in the process, it was sent to somebody expert in Sakya tradition, who again didn't object so much to the translation or the language, but to Tuken's attitude. So this shows that there may be some lingering issues, even among Western scholars, about some of the divides that Tibetans have been subject to over the years. Again, I would just, final words, I would agree with what everybody here already knows, that the translation is an exceedingly complex process. And a difficult one, but I think that if we are self-conscious about issues like audience, our method of approach, the degree of liberty we feel we can or ought to take, and these somewhat fraught questions about our relation to Indic originals, and perhaps especially the Tibetans with whom we work and without whom, in many cases, we could not do our work, that we can at least edge towards making translation something useful.
Thank you, Roger.
Okay. Hi. It's a really honor to be here and also kind of terrifying. With friends and colleagues and, you know, quite a few rock stars. You know who you are. I want to also reiterate what we've been talking about in this, you know, variable ocean of translators, that it's so wonderful to come together from these kind of two sides, and not just as groups, but as individuals, because I think practitioners are becoming scholars, scholars are becoming practitioners, and, you know, it's becoming much more sort of holistic individually as well as a group. From my side, you know, I'm coming from totally the practice side originally, and as I pointed out, I'm just, you know, kind of faking my way through scholarship. But after, you know, just doing it, and I wanted to tell you, you know, since Professor Bellows said why he became a translator, that I didn't actually plan to be a translator, but I started learning Tibetan because I found translators so annoying. Isn't it ironic? So I feel like, you know, there's this opportunity that we have, and this quote that I got from Bhikkhu Bodhi has been up there this whole time, so you've probably already read it, so I'm not going to read it out loud, but I feel like Bhikkhu Bodhi has become the sort of Rumi of Buddhism. You know, he's so quotable and so articulate, and I can't do that well. But there is this, a lot like the responsibility in the end of, you know, what we are trying to do, no matter how hard it is. So starting to think about theory after just so many years of just doing it, without thinking about theory, has been very illuminating and very interesting. But I want to get off my chest right off the bat that, you know, my own theories and other people's theories, my translations do not live up to them. And they seem to be made sort of for ideal situations of, you know, as if we had time, as if we had weeks and weeks and weeks to find the perfect, you know, translation for one line, you know, as if we had qualified informants around, you know, like, where's my pandita? I want my pandita that I work with that lives in the basement that I can, you know, I can consult instead of, you know, running around after llamas like musk deer, you know, trying to get a few clarifications. I just, you know, I don't need to repeat all the difficulties, but something is kind of coming together. So I wanted to talk about intention, and Janet just told me this morning that's very old-fashioned, but I think at 63 I'm entitled to be old, you know, if not so fashioned. But and so as a nod towards modernity, I'm going to show a YouTube video. Go ahead. Please forgive the language. Cover your ears if you're worried. I think I'm going to show a video. And think about intentionality while you watch.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Now, before I begin, I just want to say that I know a lot of people out there seem to think that I don't get angry. That's just not true. I get angry a lot. It's just that the way I express passion is different from most. So, just so there's no more confusion, we've hired Luther here to be my anger translator. Luther?
Hi.
First off, concerning the recent developments in the Middle Eastern region, I just want to reiterate our unflinching support for all people and their right to a democratic process.
Hey, all y'all dictators out there, keep messing around and see what happens. Just see what happens. Watch!
Also, to the governments of Iran and North Korea, we once again urge you to discontinue your uranium enrichment program.
Hey, Mahmoud, Kim Jong, I think I already told both y'all, 86 your shit, bitches. I'm gonna come over there and do it for y'all. Please test me and see what happens.
On the domestic front, I just want to say to my critics, I hear your voices, and I'm aware of your concerns.
So maybe if you can chill the hell out for like a second, then maybe I can focus on some shit, you know?
That goes for everybody, including members of the Tea Party.
Oh, don't even get me started on these motherfuckers right here.
I assure you that we will be looking for new compromises with the GOP in the months ahead.
And you know these motherfuckers gonna say no before I even suggest some shit.
Now, I know a lot of folks say that I haven't done a good job at communicating my accomplishments to the public.
Because y'all motherfuckers don't listen.
Since being in office, we've created 3 million new jobs.
3 million new jobs.
We ended the war in Iraq.
Ended a war, y'all. We ended a war. Remember that?
These achievements should serve as a reminder that I am on your side.
I am not a Muslim.
And that my intentions as your president are coming from the right place.
They coming from Hawaii, which is where I'm from, which is in the United States of America, y'all. Okay? This is ridiculous. I have a birth certificate. I have a birth certificate. I have a hot, diggity, daggity, mama say, mama samu, Marcus on birth certificate, you dumbass crackers.
Okay.
So,
Luther, rope it in.
you're down the back with the damn.
In conclusion, last night I had a conversation with Michelle.
I said, bitch.
Nope, I did not say that. I did not say that.
So try and draw back the energy from there. Which one is more true? Yeah, which one is more true? You know, the real feelings that are going on, such as Luther is expressing, or the intention that President Obama has, being diplomatic. I think we could say that that's his intention, is not to be exposing truth, actually, but to leave it to be interpreted, to leave it as thinly veiled threats, maybe, and still be sort of unaccountable for saying them. And so it almost invites interpretation, whereas Luther, you know, there's nothing more to say. It's very clear. It's the best communication. The communication is clear. So I thought that was kind of interesting in thinking about intention. Another example that might be a little more appropriate is my friend Peter Roberts translating the Samadhi Raja Sutra, which is, you may know, is often cited as the source of the Kagyu teachings, especially of Mahamudra. And there being nothing, I hear, about Mahamudra in it whatsoever. And then in Trungpa Rinpoche acknowledging that said, well, it's because, you know, we really should relate to the intention behind the sutra. So the question is that who gets to decide what the intention behind the sutra is? And I feel like there's many people all along the way, starting with Buddha word, you know, and even that, I mean, Magadi and, you know, what, and, you know, that's already interpreted. And all the way along the line is this long, long line of translators, and we're just like the end. You know, we're at the end, and then there may be more. It's not the final end game, because then you, as a translator, might be translated into another language, and then anything can happen out of control, as you know. So, you know, it's unavoidable, you know, as Stephen Jim said, it's unavoidable that you have to make these decisions at some point. And we have this formulaic Tibetan thing, and I translate primarily from, you know, Tibetan source text, not Sanskrit, because I don't know it. And, you know, where it says, you know, the intention is said right at the beginning. You know, first it says, you know, I know nothing, you know, all humble, I know nothing, you know, I'm Jon Snow, I know nothing. And then, oh, I'm just doing this to clarify for my own good. And then finally, but in case anybody has benefited, for all sentient beings, may it be a benefit. And I find it interesting that we kind of automatically dismiss the first two without question. We dismiss that the person, the author, knows nothing and that he's just doing it for himself. And then we believe, on surface, you know, just face value, that it's for the benefit of all beings. And then that we have to take that as the intention. There's really no choice. I mean, you can analyze, even such as Professor Quintman's talk a couple of days ago in Boulder, analyzing Sangyon Haruka's motivations that are kind of very interesting and nuanced. You know, it's not quite that simple, and we can assume that it never is. And yet, we don't know, and so we have to basically go on that intention. But that leaves the horrible dangling question of you know, well, if we're going to follow the intention, and maybe I'll take your challenge of what is the it that we are translating, and say that it's that intention, but you still are left with, well, what is beneficial? And is what was beneficial then beneficial now? And, you know, if we're going to put it in English or French, I feel I have to emphasize French. France took quite a beating this morning. If we put it into French or English, you know, vernacular, well, the Tibetan wasn't in vernacular in most cases. Very rarely is it in Tibetan vernacular. So then that's another interpretation translation, first of all. And then we have to think, is it helpful? And I mean, I've been sort of typecast as, you know, translator of Chut, and I think I'm on like my 30th text of Chut, and I just want to use that as an extreme example. How is that put into an accessible language to people who, you know, chopping up the body, giving it to, I mean, you know, it's practically impossible. I mean, people have demythologized it, psychologized it, done every possible kind of thing to it, but I don't feel like that's the translator's, I don't feel like that's my job. That's somebody else's job who fancy themselves as teachers and should me read my translations. But to put those kind of ideas back onto the intention of an author, I think would be too far. It would be too much. It would actually be untrue. You know, to say, well, demons don't really exist, so, you know, just forget it, you guys. That's not in there. And so, anyway, I thought that was an interesting way to think about it in terms of extreme case. I think that's probably pretty extreme. But there's still hope, I think, that something useful can happen. And I'd like to end with next one, by T.S. Eliot again, since we were on the T.S. Eliot. Translation is valuable by a double power of fertilizing a literature by importing new elements, which may be assimilated, and by restoring the essentials, which have been forgotten in traditional literary method. There occurs in the process a happy fusion between the spirit of the original and the mind of the translator. The result is not exoticism, but rejuvenation. So that's sort of hopeful. I'm not sure, but you know, I think it could be a positive product. Thank you.
Thank you. So you proved my point of your sense of humor.
I had Kay and Peele do that.
Yes, but you did bring it in. So I'm actually going to open it up for the discussion right away. So if any of you have any comments, questions to each other.
Well, I guess I've got a question for Jinpa, coming out of, you know, this fascinating but concise presentation. The figures you were dealing with were essentially from the Chidar period, right?
Well, the Daju Pampunyipa is another, though.
Sorry?
Daju Pampunyipa is another. The first one is another.
Yeah. He's in the Ngadar.
The bilingual lexicon. That's from Ngadar.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. So there was reflection on it going on over the course of many centuries anyway. My main question, though, was, is the reflection on this, once this great process of translation has ended, do people talk about this in the 18th, 19th centuries?
Well, not specifically on translation per se, but in some of the authors, more critically minded authors' writings, you do see, you know, quite often kind of musings on a particular terminology. And, you know, for example, like Tsongkhapa would quite often compare different translations and would, for example, in his commentary on Entering the Middle Way, you know, although the standard translation is that of Patsap, but he often chooses Nakto Lotsawa's translation over Patsap. So you do get, you know, and then you see the same kind of approach in subsequent writers, but there is no specific kind of discussion of translation per se, because Sapen's treatment of that in Kinju was quite extensive. and it was really seen as kind of the standard kind of understanding. So this suggestion that this it, what is that it that we're bringing across? Maybe we can identify that as an intention of the author. I'm not quite sure, because that puts a huge amount of responsibility on the translator.
Yeah.
Because sometimes authors' intention are probably not that clear to themselves. So in those kind of situations, you do have a text in front of you. Mm-hmm. And the fact that there's a text in front of you does presuppose the possibility of being able to translate it. Mm-hmm. So, so how, I don't know I think intention is part of it, but I think there is probably more to intention, because the intention is very individual. Mm-hmm. Whereas from my point of view, although I don't go to this, extreme of French critical theory, which argues that once the author has written the text, author has no priority of claim over the meaning of what he has written, because it's a social kind of, product. Although I wouldn't go that far, but I do think they have a point, because, intention is individual, but the product is a text that already presupposes certain background and participates in a shared kind of language and concepts. So I'm wondering what is that other thing that we might need to add on to intention. Yeah. So I don't know if you...
Well, I completely agree with you. There is, I don't agree that, some colleagues have said, well, the Dharma teachings are sort of unmoored in historical time, and I don't buy that at all. They come out of time and place very clearly. And intention is the same. We don't know what's actually going on. But I feel like that's all we have, is that little statement. Like, we have to assume it in a way.
Yes.
We could analyze, well, maybe they were trying to impress somebody, or maybe their jindak was, thing. Or all kinds of motivations, They were arguing because Sayagyi Pandita insulted them, whatever. Of course, all of that is there, but I just think it's quite hard to that seems like more like, japture, like you would want to set that context, but in the actual translation, in a way, I feel like I have to just trust a little bit, because I don't know.
Sure.
So that intention, has to be this, as Professor Bella said, the kindness to the reader. It has to be, without necessarily being like vernacular or idiomatic even, but you have to think that was a good intention, because otherwise, why would you be? Except for some scholarly interest, why would you be translating it if not for edification? And then the decision becomes this difficult thing.
I think I would just throw, if you throw the it question at me, my first answer would simply be the words on the page before me. Obviously, then you have to be educated in it, you have to know the language, you have to know context and all that, but that seems to me the it. Intention, I think if we think about intention, we need to think about our own intentions too. And again, this gets back to the point of a point that I touched on perhaps about there are many different contexts in which translations of Tibetan texts into English have been produced. Some of them are academic. Some of them are intended more for an audience of, let's say, well-educated practitioners. And a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism may have, at some level, a desire to help transmit Tibetan Buddhism, but probably in a college university setting, that's not the primary motivation, whereas that, I think, is the primary motivation. Transmission is key for many people, whereas in an academic setting, it's not always the same. Having said that, I should admit that when I applied to the University of Wisconsin graduate program in 1975, my essay read something like, I hope to learn Tibetan and Sanskrit so that I can help spread Buddhism to the West. I'm still incredulous that they accepted. I got in. Yeah.
But I mean, sometimes I've, in my own translation work, sort of, as a Tibetan, it's a slightly weird situation because in an ideal scenario, you should be translating into your own native language. Whereas for me, it's sort of what George Bellows would call kind of L2 translation. I'm sort of an L2 language 2 translation. But sometimes I get into a situation where I question if the author himself actually knows what he's talking about.
Well,
and then what do you do?
you can do that. I can't.
So, I think there is. I mean, and that's when the translation gets very interesting because still you can produce something, but if you flesh it out and make it clearer, then I mean, is that a translation? Mm-hmm. So that I think it's an interesting question. And then sometimes, for example, when I did the mind training book, it has around 40 texts, over a dozen authors in it. How do I make sure that all the texts don't sound the same? Because it's one person who is translating it. The texts are written by different people, and the quality of writing in Tibetan is very different. Some authors are horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, like in Tibetan, you read a page and you get I got to go back to it, And some authors are brilliant. You can't stop reading. I mean, that's human. I mean, it happens in English writing. So does in
you should
Tibetan.
get terrible translators and brilliant translators.
so what do you do? I mean, in those kind of situations, and that's when I found out that you can never really step out of your own shadow, because in the end, what you produce is really, to a large extent, your product. So I don't know if you have struggled with those kind of multiple authors in one volume.
As I said, I'm on my 30th church liturgy, not even commentary. So it's really a problem, and it's a problem to make it not only sounding different and reflecting it, but also just for the English, to keep it. I don't know who reads these things anyway, but you want to try and make it readable.
Readable, yeah.
Without using such a limited vocabulary that you find.
But do you try to create a rhythm in the sentence so that it could be sung?
Well, I don't
know really,
people do.
In Tibetan, the one of the unique features of chö is that you should be able to sing it.
I know. It will take someone more talented than I to do that.
Just to chime in on this, the idea of making it sort of singable, there are efforts by translators. I know there's a French translator who tries to do that. He tries to make, not with chö in particular, but with verses. He tries to keep the verse structure perfectly intact, but also to make it so that you can actually sing
it.
Verses.
There's been a lot of attempts at that, actually.
Yeah, Rob Pierce did the Lama Chopa version in that. But, you pay a price because it doesn't read well. That's the problem,
Exactly.
English has too many syllables.
I was also going to say that to Jimbala, your comments on in the end you can never really step out of your own skin echoes quite a bit what something that David Bellows said of translation. In the end, says what the translator wants it to say.
Yeah.
So I found that interesting, and also the idea of there's a question that came up while we're discussing this is. How do our own intentions, or how does our intention in translating a text affect the way we are going to understand what we considered the intention of the author of the original text? Mm-hmm. Because when we're translating, we're making all sorts of choices. Yeah. Who are we translating for? Mm-hmm. How we structure it. Do we do we remain faithful, more closely faithful to the original text? Or do we decide to be particularly kind to our readers? These are all things that we'd have to take into consideration. So something that came to mind.
I mean, one thing that I find quite helpful is that if I'm translating, say, for example, like the Book of Kadam was another challenging project that I did. I try to, as much as possible, try to get to know the individuals, the authors, the key players. because their sectarian allegiances, their commitment to a particular lineage of teaching, their personal relationships really makes a difference when you read the text. Because after all, they're all human beings. I mean, they have as much emotions as we do, and there are constraints. Sometimes they do certain things out of deference to their teacher, and that may not be their own position. So I personally find that really helpful to really kind of read as much as around the author, when I start reading the text. So I don't know, I mean, other people might have different approaches.
But does that, I mean, kind of like Kay and Peele, is that what they intended you to know?
No, but the thing, it comes through often in tones.
Yes,
for example, like if they may be making a reference to a particular person's viewpoint, their background would affect the way in which, and then you can understand why there is that particular tone. And you want to retain that tone in the English translation. If it is reverential, if it is dismissive, that matters. Because that's an important part of the whole meaning. And in order to get that, you need to have some larger background of what was happening. For example, like when you look at Korampa's critique of Tsongkhapa's Madhyamaka, if you don't understand that Tsongkhapa studied at Sakya, then started writing original works without citing any authoritative sources from Sakya, then of course, some of the Sakya thinkers are going to look at him as like an upstart, who's disloyal or ungrateful. So it's very human. Then you can begin to understand, and then the tone in which these kind of statements are made needs to be retained. So I think that, so you have to read a larger kind of...
But there also, when you think, though, about Indic materials, it becomes generally more problematic, I think, because we know so little about so many of the really vital figures in Indic tradition. Certainly in dealing with Saraha, Kanha, Tilopa, I was dealing with people who we know almost nothing historically about. And that, of course, it tempts one to just sort of make something up. And also, with regard to the Indic materials, the whole question of how much I tried in Tantric Treasure simply to, as I kind of said in answer to the it question, to just read the texts before me and not to allow myself to be too influenced by commentaries that had been written later by some Indians, mostly by Tibetans. And I think this is an issue as well, whether you're reading Saraha or Dharmakirti or the Abhisamaya Alankara or whatever it may be, the degree to which we the influence that later commentarial traditions, and in our case, particularly Tibetan commentarial traditions, have on the way we present, talk about, even translate the Indic original.
Well, great. I think maybe we can open it up to the floor for further questions and discussion. There are 2 microphones. Feel free to.
First of all, thank you so much. I really always appreciate the disclaimers at the beginning of texts. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think one that came to my mind, I believe George Bernard Shaw once said that the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has been accomplished. So I want to offer something that's had a great deal of kind of raw explanatory power for me. It's the theme that we've been circumambulating here that was intimated in one of the questions. And this is a contribution that comes from the West that I offer with some hesitation, because whenever we mention things like psychology, it's almost a pejorative in a group like this. But for me, it's really helpful to understand that for the last 100 years or so, hundreds of developmentalists have articulated levels of cultural and intellectual development. So when a translator translates a text, obviously they're translating it through their level of development. And this has really been suggested by so much of what we're talking about. And the problem with these levels is that they aren't things that we see, that we can't look at, we look through. So they are the sort of the inherent poisons that infect what we translate. So again, it's as if what Dr. Belos was saying, that we have to take the responsibility of bringing meaning into the target text. So I'm wondering if this is just an offering, if you have any comments about that approach, that kind of Western psychological approach to bringing a greater sense of humility and also understanding the blind spots that infect us, of which we have really very little awareness.
I mean, I would endorse humility always.
And I apologize if it sounded pejorative to mention psychology. There is a tendency to go back and psychologize some of these figures that are authors from a Western psychology point of view, like that I don't think is always. I mean, I think the psyche of different, time and place people is quite different, and that there's a danger and tendency to do that. I'm going to take a random example of kind of like Jamgon Control and like, oh, he was so upset because, he was, his Nyingma roots were taken away from him and he was made to become Khargyu because of politics. He didn't seem that upset. I mean, I feel like that's he loved his teacher, Situ Rinpoche. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that we tend to do that we have to watch out. But going down to the other end, how can we not have the language of psychology, which we're so embedded in? Yes, it's the responsibility to give meaning, but I would not say there's no meaning there already. There is already meaning there. And then the job is to translate. I mean, I think it would actually be a sort of arrogance to think we're giving meaning to the text. I think that, I think we have to see what would maybe be an equivalent. Ideally, what would be the equivalent reaction in a person reading it in translation than was elicited in the original Tibetan? But that's very, very tricky and difficult.
Yeah. I think my own sense is there might be translations and translations. The kind of interpretation you're suggesting is, I think, another level of conceptual translation. And I don't know, I don't personally feel, as a translator, it's my job to do that second level translation. So, for me, in this sense, I may be more on the non-adaptive side, on George, David Bellos's kind of schema. One thing that I've always admired about the Tibetan translations of classical Indian texts is that they were done in such a way that the texts themselves are flexible enough to open to different interpretations coming from different philosophical perspectives. And that I see as a richness. It's also quite hard to do. You don't want a kind of meaningless text that is quite banal and kind of, devoid of any particular meaning. You want a really robust text, but at the same time, you don't want to skew the meaning of that particular text from a particular perspective, say Yogacara or Madhyamaka or whatever it is, or Sutrantika. So this is one area where the Tibetans have been tremendously successful. If you look at, Abhisama Alamkara, which, the Tibetan text itself allows interpretation coming from Yogacara, Madhyamaka Prasangika, Madhyamaka, all of this. Similarly, if you look at Dharmakirti's text, the way in which the Tibetans have done it allows all that multiplicity of interpretation. Whether Dharmakirtis accept this or accept that. All of this can be supported by and this is where I hope and wish that the level of English translation from Tibetan text would strive. So there is a clarity in the target language, there's a rigor, there's a robustness, but at the same time, the interpretation, it would support the multiplicity of the interpretation that the other teachers can use. So now, at that second level of translation, then someone can take an anthropological perspective and read the text. Someone can take a kind of depth psychology kind of type, Jungian type analysis and read the text. Someone can come up with a Derridian deconstructionist, critical theory or whatever. Then that's just another level of translation. And if you do that as the first level, then all the other possible interpretations are ruled out.
That's excellent.
And this is my view, yeah.
Yeah, that's really good.
Okay, I just wanted to ask Sarah, I guess, for a little exegesis of the quotation that's been up here on the screen. Translation imports new elements which may be assimilated, but how does it restore essentials which have been forgotten in traditional literary method? Can you give some examples of that?
Examples?
Or just talk about it in general.
That would take a little while to think of examples. I think what it indicates is that there's a this rejuvenation or refreshment in the target language that can be, I feel like sometime you can take that liberty that it might have become a little stale or dry, in terms of more, not so much forgotten, maybe that's a little too extreme, but it could be kind of repetitive, as you know, in Tibetan, it's, they freely and happily plagiarize a lot, and it gets a sort of, repetitive, and that by a translation that can refreshen that, and for our ears and for the target audience, making it more more accessible, and maybe even having new ideas, as Tujin Jinpa was saying. There's there's different levels of meaning that could be brought out without taking away anything, that could be actually presented and make it, more interesting, I hope. I mean, I try not to go too much into vernacular, but on the other hand, it's kind of irresistible to have some interesting words in there sometime. If I was going to, allow myself to go totally vernacular, I would definitely stick with the language of the 60s and 70s, which I think is perfect for, like, Mongpa, freak out, or
chill out.
Whatever, but chill out would be, Gompa. But I just, it would be archaic already, so there's no point. But I do allow it, because it just gets awfully dull, I have to say. I want the reader to at least not give up or, fall asleep.
It reminds, what you're talking about reminds me a little bit of debates that I know kicked around for some time among translators of the Pali Canon, which of course is famous for its repetitiveness. And I think, we're all aware that most modern translators have chosen to use a lot of ellipses for what in the original is indeed a great deal of repetition. But those who have argued against that approach, and I don't think they get published all that often, are those who say that, remember, these were memorized texts, these texts had ritual functions, and if you simply use ellipses and don't get the power of the repetitiveness. Think about if you think about something like a Christian hymn or some biblical passage that has these tremendously powerful repetitions to them, and we know in our cultural context that the power comes in part from the repetition, and yet we think, we don't have the time for this when we're looking at a similar example in another culture. I don't know whether the Tibetan instance fits quite the same way, but what you said reminded me of that.
Yeah. I don't know if that answered me, but close enough, maybe.
No.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody. To ask my question, I have to give a little bit of background. I'm pretty much strictly an oral interpreter. I've been translating for one Kempo for 12 years, and he has 3 Kempo degrees from Sartar, Kempo Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche's monastery in Tibet, Pena Rinpoche's monastery in southern India, and also Katok in Kham. And the question I have is about, is the responsibility of the text to the oral lineage on the...
Yeah, I know what you're going to ask.
I am always struggling because most often when I take these texts, especially something that's quite academic, like Umalajukpa. I'm not even going to try to say it in Tibet or Sanskrit, or Umatsawi Sherab, or Ngeshe Drunme, and so forth. When I take a translation from someone and am translating the oral teachings on that, they are quite distant from each other. And I have is it my responsibility as the oral interpreter to bridge that gap, or should the translators that are translating the written works also base that on the oral transmission?
Well, you're the voice, so you...
yeah, I mean, this is actually quite tricky. For example, like, I only interpret for His Holiness, so, and, in my case, I have the advantage of the teacher being someone whose command of English is very good, so I cannot stray too far, because he catches me. But what I do notice is that, for example, if he's giving a commentary on a text, if possible, I try to bring my own translation. Because, you can never step out of your own skin, and Lama is commenting and it's pointing to a particular line and a stanza, and you have to repeat that. And if you repeat from an existing translation and you don't agree with the vocabulary or even the understanding that is presented there, then you're kind of stuck. So, and often I end up, if I haven't had the time to do this particular text myself, then I end up kind of self-correcting right there on the spot. So I will be reading, and then sometimes the audience members who are more perceptive will say, "My goodness, you're reading from another text." I mean, we all have the same program, but I'm kind of, automatically editing as I read, so that I can interpret, His Holiness's teaching. So I think it's, I wouldn't go so far as to suggest that the textual translation should be done in such a way that it really respects the oral tradition. That I think will be going too far. In fact, the oral tradition of these teachings are really based upon the existence of a text. You do have sometimes Sindhis which are written down, notes taken at teachings, where the written text comes after, it's where the oral tradition is the priority. But most of the texts are actually originally written as a text, and then the oral commentarial traditions evolved on the basis of that. So if anything, the written text has to take priority. That's my view, yeah.
On this matter of repetition, prosodic beauty in a lot of Tibetan texts involves using the same word or homonyms as many times as you can in a stanza. And it's very beautiful in Tibetan. If you do that in English, it's just awful.
Yeah.
The readers won't put up with it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what to do with that problem.
I think many of us have stopped trying to be consistent. Actually, allowing ourselves not to translate the same word the same way every time. Yes. I mean, it just is too awful. Yeah. So that's one part.
Well, to be fair, one of the difference between Tibetan and English is that English has a far larger vocabulary.
Yes, it does. Yes, very more.
Just look at the dictionary. Yeah. You look at OED and you look at Tibetan dictionary. So Tibetans generally tend to be much more contextual. Same word could mean differently in different contexts. Yes. So in those situations, it makes no sense to offer the same English term every time it comes up.
And even when it means the same, we have many words that mean the same thing, and it just adds flavor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, though
you don't agree.
I don't agree entirely, because at least if we're talking about poetry, again, I think that a Tibetan poem where there's a deliberate repetition of the word numerous times, that has force, and I think it needs to be respected. I was going to comment before that when you talked about hoping that we could find a level of English translation that somehow respected the subtlety of these terms and yet was in English. My response is, well, I'm not the one who's going to achieve that, but there are still footnotes.
True. Yeah.
You've been talking about, somebody mentioned the importance of intentionality.
So I wanted to raise the question of the reception of translation. To go back to what David Bellis was saying this morning, you know, there was quite an ill-tempered exchange between Jerome and Augustine on the translation of the Vulgate. Jerome was correcting the already existing Latin translations in the light of what he called the Veritas Hebraica, the Hebrew truth, that the Old Testament translation should be based on the Hebrew. But when the new translation was read in certain churches in North Africa, the people noticed that what he was saying was not what they were used to, and it caused a riot. And Augustine had his own reasons for saying that actually the older translations were preferable because they were closer to the Septuagint, which was the text that the apostles had given to the church. And then if you jump ahead to the translation of the Bible in the 16th century, Tyndale produced a new translation into English in which he retranslated, or rather translated certain key terms in his own way. And as you may know, there was a furious controversy between him and Thomas More. And Thomas More was saying he was falsifying the meaning of the scriptures by using new and strange translations. So there was a heretical translation and an orthodox translation, and the heretical translation was burned as much as it could be burned, and eventually Tyndale himself was burned. But my point is that whether one judges the quality or the value of this translation or that really depends on criteria that are not found in the texts themselves.
Yeah.
So I was very interested when you mentioned this case of Jerome, who preferred another translation. And I was wondering, actually, on what criteria did he prefer it? Because obviously it's not something that he could find in the translation, and as far as I know, he didn't know Sanskrit.
No.
He must have had another agenda for saying that this translation was better than the other.
Yes. I think quite often he would use a kind of a certain assumption of a coherence in the overall position of the text. And then he will be comparing to Chantakirti's own auto commentary of that particular section. So it's a sort of a much more cumulative kind of criteria. But large part of that is really a certain supposition of a certain coherence of the overall position. And then some of them also has to do with the way in which the grammatical particles, the way in which the Sanskrit words are chopped and translated into Tibetan makes a difference. And those kind of, the one thing that we have to understand is that although that many of the Tibetans did not know Sanskrit in a real sense, but it was expected that any scholar worth of his salt was expected to have studied Da, which is basically Sanskrit linguistics. And you have to master the basic Samdhi rules and some other kind of, affixes rules, the way in which affixes modify. Those, any scholar worth his salt was expected to study Da. So someone like Jerome would be familiar with Da. So that gives them some understanding of how the Samdhi rules and the Tibetan translation might have chopped the word in a different way. So that's another consideration they bring in. For example, like Jamyang Shepa, he brings up a lot of those considerations in his reading of a particular translation. So you're right, it's not in the text. You have to bring it from outside, yeah.
Can I add one thing really quick? I think that's like such a good example of translations taking on their own life as soon as they're printed. And in a way, we're all kind of stuck with some of these old English and French translations, and it doesn't help to change them because people are already quite used to them, even when they're just like out of the box, the cat.
Yeah, there was a similar situation in China where in many cases the earlier translations were less faithful in some sense to the Indic originals, but and later people like Xuanzang came along and did very precise ones, but the Chinese in general preferred the earlier ones.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is about the physical book that we produce, and we've been talking a lot about how the words on the page are what the translator decides it to be. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how that should be represented on the book in terms of the placement of the translator and the original author's names. And I think of two very different examples. If we go downstairs, we look at a lot of these books, the translator is listed right there on the cover. And then if I go to the bookstore and I pick up a copy of 100 Years of Solitude, I can be looking at 3 different copies, and I have to hunt through it to find out who translated who. Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of us in this room have favorite translators, right? I've been known to buy books because I like the translator's work, and so I think I'll like this one. And so the question is sort of, how should the translator be represented on this sort of physical object vis-a-vis the author?
Very good question. I think that maybe I don't want to kind of take over it. So you want to say something?
Well, and I can only say it reminds me of my background. My mother was a screenwriter, and if you've ever gotten involved, which I have, unfortunately, in as her heir, of the legalities of Hollywood, and whose name goes where, and how much is borrowing from somebody, and how much is it original, and how much it could get very, 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 very complicated. And Writers Guild has sued people on my behalf, even though I didn't want to, because my mother's name was like over here instead of over there. And it's we don't want to go that far. So I don't want to go there. You take it.
I think in our classic series, I can speak from my own personal experience. That was an important consideration, because one of the primary intention behind the whole classic series is to really bring up the profile of these great Tibetan masters and authors. So we debated a lot about whether the translator's name should be on the cover at all. We did end up having it, but we have it in a smaller font. The author is in a larger font and the translator is in a smaller font. But then we run into problems like, the Lojong Gyatsa, it's an anthology. There is no author. Then, and then we did the Mahamudra collection, which Peter Allen Roberts, he's here actually, he did a brilliant job. Although it took a while, but... there, because it's a collection of texts that Tangur Rinpoche produced, compiled, and at my request. So we put the compiler's name and the translator's name. So I think you have to make a decision. I mean, for the literary things, I mean, I read a lot of, translations from into English. Like, my favorite authors are really non-native English authors. Like, I tend to read a lot of Russian novels and translators make a difference. I always go for the Penguin edition because I trust the Penguins to produce really very good, readable translations. So,
and they're cheap.
Cheaper.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Okay, sorry, thank you. I wanted to ask, especially Thupten Jinpala, the point you made that the priority should be first the written text and then the oral tradition, which I totally understand, but practically isn't it often so that the root texts especially are very cryptic and are not understandable without the living tradition?
Sure.
And then in this case you have to make a choice because the commentaries are going very different directions.
Sure. I think it depends really on the purpose. For practitioners, I think the oral teachings really matter because practitioners are in the context of a community. There's a relationship with the teacher, there's a relationship with a particular lineage that has a whole history behind it. So it's a living, the teaching is being engaged with as a living, almost like a living organism. So there, I think text takes a secondary position because texts are more like when you need to consult something, when you need to verify something, it's like a kind of a resource. But the oral tradition, the oral teachings really has a much more primary role. But I was thinking here more in terms of the relationship to the actual text. The question was asked whether the text should be modified in order to suit the oral teachings. And this is where I was saying that if the text is a sindri, then it is oral teaching that has been written down as a note, which has a completely different flavor because it's closer to vernacular, it's more fluid, it's more flexible. But if text is originally written as a treatise, as a separate standalone text, then trying to adjust the translation to suit a particular teacher's oral teaching, I think is probably, in the long run, not very helpful because it precludes the possibility of this text supporting the oral commentary of another Lama or another tradition.
You do have the irony nowadays as well that so many oral teachings have been written down and are published. I mean, most of His Holiness's books are, in fact, transcriptions and reworkings and editings of various oral teachings. So the line between the oral and the written is getting blurred in certain respects.
True.
Well, transcriptions are a whole nother problem, but we don't have time to.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for your questions. And I'll pass it over to Marcus, who has some